Chapter 17. Wireless Operator Praises Heroic Work. Story of Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator of the Titanic, who was dashed overboard and rescued by lifeboat. Band played Ragtime. One of the most connected and detailed accounts of the horrible disaster was that told by Harold Bride, the wireless operator. Mr. Bride said, "In the first place, the public should not blame anyone because more wireless messages about the disaster to the Titanic did not reach shore from the Carpathia. I positively refused to send press dispatches because the bulk of personal messages with touching words of grief was so large. The wireless operators aboard the Chester got all they asked for, and they were wretched operators. They knew American Morse, but not Continental Morse sufficiently to be worthwhile. They taxed our endurance to the limit. I had to cut them out at last. They were so insufferably slow, and go ahead with our messages of grief to relatives. We sent 169 personal messages in 2 days. When I was dragged aboard the Carpathia, I went to the hospital at first. I stayed there for 10 hours. Then somebody brought word the Carpathia's wireless operator was getting queer from the work. They asked me if I could go up and help. I could not walk. Both my feet were broken or something. I don't know what. I went up upon crutches with somebody helping me. I took the key, and I never left the wireless cabin after that. Our meals were brought to us. We kept the wireless working all the time. The Navy operators were a great nuisance. I advised them all to learn the Continental Morse and learn to speed up in it if they ever expect to be worth their salt. The Chester's man knew he knew it, but he was as slow as Christmas coming. We worked all the time. Nothing went wrong. Sometimes the Carpathia man sent, and sometimes I sent. There was a bed in the wireless cabin. I could sit on it and rest my feet while sending sometimes. At the beginning, I joined the Titanic at Belfast. I was born at Nunhead, England, 22 years ago, and joined the Marconi forces last July. I first worked on the Haverford, and then on the Lusitania. I joined the Titanic at Belfast. Asleep when the crash came. I didn't have much to do aboard the Titanic except to relieve Phillips from midnight until sometime in the morning, when he should be through sleeping. Chapter 18. Story of the Steward. Passengers and crew dying when taken aboard Carpathia. One woman saved a dog. English colonel swam for hours with mother when boat capsized. Some of the most thrilling incidents connected with the rescue of the Titanic survivors are told in the following account, given by a man trained to the sea, a steward of the rescue ship Carpathia. At midnight on Sunday, April 14th, I was on the promenade deck of the steamer Carpathia, bound for the Mediterranean at the time, and 3 days out from New York, when an urgent summons came to my room from the chief steward, E. Harry Hughes. I then learned that the White Star Line liner Titanic, the great ship afloat, had struck an iceberg and was in serious difficulties. We were then already steaming on our greatest power to the scene of the disaster, Captain Rostron having immediately given orders that every man of the crew should stand by to exert his utmost efforts. Within a few minutes, every preparation had been made to receive 200 or 300 persons. Blankets were placed ready, tables laid with hot soups and coffee, bedding, etc., prepared, and hospital supplies and surgeries laid out ready to attend any injured. The men were then mustered in the saloon and addressed by the chief steward. He told them of the disaster and appealed to them in a few words to show the world the stuff that Britishers were made of, and to add a glorious page to the history of the Empire. And right well did the men respond to the appeal. Every lifeboat was manned and ready to be launched at a moment's notice. Nothing further could be done but anxiously wait and look out for the ship's distress signals. Our Marconi operator, whose unceasing efforts for many hours deserved the greatest possible praise, was unable at the time to get any reply to the urgent inquiries he was sending out, and he feared the worst. At last the blue flare was observed, to which we replied with a rocket. Day was just dawning when we observed a boat in the distance. Iceberg and first boat sighted. Eastward on the horizon, a huge iceberg, the cause of the disaster, majestically reared two noble peaks to heaven. Rope ladders were already lowered, and we hove to near the lifeboat, which was now approaching us as rapidly as the nearly exhausted efforts of the men at the oars could bring her. Chapter 19. Experiences told by other survivors. Many incidents related by eyewitnesses bring out points of pathos and bravery. Heartrending were the stories of the survivors. Many who had been stirred by previous newspaper reports were touched to the quick when the pathetic stories, so rich in human appeal, were published. One of the most dramatic accounts of the awful disaster and the horror which followed it, that related by Mrs. W.B. Stevenson of Haverford, Pennsylvania, who was among the coolest and most collective of all survivors. Mrs. Stevenson paid a glowing tribute to the courage and heroism of the men. She declared that the sacrifices made by the men in behalf of the women and children cost them their lives. This was particularly so, she said, in the case of Mr. John B. Thayer and Mr. George D. Widener. Mrs. Stevenson's own story of the wreck and its thrilling incidents follows. It was shortly before midnight, Sunday night, when those of the passengers who had retired were awakened by a severe shock, followed by a rumbling noise that lasted several minutes. The Titanic gave a lurch, and then swayed, and in a moment came to a stop. I took time to dress. When I made my way out to the deck, everything was in confusion. Women were rushing about in their night clothes, weeping and crying, and in many instances clinging to small children. When I reached the upper deck, I met Mr. Thayer. He was perfectly calm and gave no indication of being the least bit alarmed, although by this time evidence of alarm was showing by the men and the members of the crew. Mr. Thayer suggested in a quiet way that I should go on to the upper deck and secure a life preserver. He urged me to remain calm and said that he felt sure that the liner was safe and had only encountered an ice field. Later, when the lifeboats were ordered lowered, Mr. Thayer and Mr. Widener stood by, leaving every assistance in lowering the lifeboats and placing the women and children in them. Both Mr. Thayer and Mr. Widener repeatedly cautioned the men against disorder and insisted that the women and children be assisted first. I was lowered into the boat containing Mrs. Thayer and Mrs. Widener. The women were hopeful that their husbands were safe. Both Mrs. Thayer and Mrs. Widener felt confident that their husbands had been lowered into another lifeboat and picked up by a passing steamer. Mrs. Thayer and Mrs. Widener were hopeful to the last and did not seem to realize that their loved ones were really lost until the Carpathia had reached the dock. We suffered intensely from the cold and exposure during the several hours that we were drifting about in the lifeboat. Chapter 20. How the world received the news. National prostrated with grief, messages from kings and cardinals. Excitement tense. Young and old, rich and poor, were prostrated by the news of the disaster, and even Wall Street was neglected. As one banker remarked, "Nobody has any interest in the stock market or in any other matter of the trivial business which we carry on down here so long as this calamity is fresh in our minds." Such a horror overawes mere business and driving it out of our hearts. Our behavior in the face of it is quite punctuary and habitual. What we accomplish then means nothing, for our interest is away from our work. There is far more humanity down here than most people know, because it takes just a shock as this to bring it out. Nor was the grief confined to America. European nations felt the horror of the calamity and sent expressions of sympathy. President Taft made public cablegrams received from the King and Queen of England and the King of Belgium, conveying their sympathy to the American people in the sorrows which have followed the Titanic disaster. The President's response to both messages were also made public. The following was a cablegram from King George dated at Sandringham. "The Queen and I are anxious to assure you and the American nation of the great sorrow which we experienced at the terrible loss of life that has occurred among the American citizens, as well as among my own subjects, by the foundering of the Titanic. Our two countries are so intimately allied by ties of friendship and brotherhood that any misfortunes which affect the one must necessarily affect the other. In the present terrible occasion, they are both equally suffering. George R. and I." President Taft's reply was as follows: "In the presence of the appalling disaster to the Titanic, the people of the two countries are brought into community of grief through their common bereavement. The American people share in the sorrow of their kinsmen beyond the sea. On behalf of my countrymen, I thank you for your sympathetic message. William H. Taft." The message from King Albert of Belgium was as follows: "I beg your excellency to accept my deepest condolences on the occasion of the frightful catastrophe to the Titanic, which has caused such mourning in the American nation." Chapter 21. Bravery on the Officers and the Crew. Illustrious career of Captain E.J. Smith, maintenance of order and discipline, acts of heroism, cool to the end, the criticism of Ismay, criminal and cowardly conduct charged, proper caution not exercised when presence of icebergs were known, should have stayed on board to help in work of rescue, selfish and unsympathetic actions on board the Carpathia. Ismay's defense. Into the last lifeboat that was launched from the ship, Captain Smith, with his own hand, lifted a small child into the seat beside its mother. As the gallant officer performed his final act of humanity, several who were already in the boat tried to force the captain to join them, but he turned away resolutely toward the bridge. The act was significant. When the disaster was first reported, everyone predicted that the captain would go down with the ship. Courteous, kindly, of quiet demeanor and soft words, he was known and loved by thousands of travelers. Only once was he in trouble, when the Olympic, of which he was in command, collided with the British cruiser Hawke, an assault in 1911. That Captain Smith was held responsible by the line for this collision was made plain when he was put in command of the Titanic, the newest and biggest of the White Star liners and the flagship of their fleet. When the English firm A. Gibson & Company of Liverpool purchased the American clipper Senator Weber in 1869, Captain Smith, then a boy, sailed on her, For 7 years he was an apprentice to the Senator Weber, leaving that vessel to go on the Lizzie Fennel, a square rigger, as fourth officer. From there he went to the old Celtic of the White Star Line as fourth officer, and in 1887 he became captain of that vessel. For the first time he was in command of the freighters Titanic and Runic. Then he became skipper of the old Adriatic. Subsequently he assumed command of the Celtic, Britannic, Coptic, which was in the Australian trade, Germanic, Baltic, Majestic, Adriatic, Olympic, and Titanic. It was not easy to get Captain Smith to talk of his experiences. He had grown up in the service with his comment, and it meant little to him that he had been transferred from a small vessel to a big ship, and then to a bigger ship, and finally on the biggest of them all. One might think that a captain taken from a small ship and put on a big one might feel transition. He once said, "Not at all. The skippers of the big vessels have grown up to them, year after year. Through all these years, first there was the sailing vessel, and then what we would now call small ships. They were big in the days gone by, to the giants of today." Chapter 22. Criticism of Ismay. Criminal and cowardly conduct charged. Proper caution not exercised when presence of an iceberg was known. Should have stayed on board to help in work of rescue. Selfish and unsympathetic actions on board the Carpathia. Ismay's defense. William E. Carter's statement. From the moment that Bruce Ismay's name was seen among those of the survivors of the Titanic, he became the object of accurate attacks in every quarter where the subject of the disaster was discussed. Bitter criticism held that he should have been the last to leave the doomed vessel. His critics insisted that the managing director of the White Star Line, his responsibility was greater even than Captain Smith's. And while granting that his survival might be still explained, they condemned his apparent lack of heroism. Even in England, her survival was held to be one great blot, an otherwise noble display of masculine courage. A prominent official of the White Star Line shook his head meaningly when asked if he thought that Ismay's escape with the women and children. The general feeling seemed to be that he should have stayed aboard the sinking vessel, looking out for those who were left, playing the man like Major Butt, and many others, and going down with the ship as Captain Smith did. He was also charged with urging a speed record, with ignoring information received with regards to the icebergs. Feeling in England. A belief in England was that Captain of the Carpathia had acted under Ismay's influence in refusing to permit any account of the disaster to be transmitted previously to the arrival of the vessel in New York. Ismay's telegram, making arrangements for the immediate deportation of the survivors among the Titanic's crew, was to be part of the same scheme to delay, if not to prevent, their stories of the wreck from being obtained in New York. Another circumstance was created. A damaging impression was Ismay's failure to give the names of the surviving crew, whose distraught families were entitled to as much consideration as those relatives who occupied the most expensive suites on the Titanic. The anguish endured by the families of members of the crew was reported as indescribable, and Southampton was literally turned into a city of weeping and tragic pathos. The wives of 2 members of the crew died of shock and suspense. Cried for food. Mr. Ismay's actions while on a Carpathia were also criticized as selfish and unwarrantable. "For God's sake, get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is. Bring it to me." This was the first statement made by Mr. Ismay a few minutes after he was landed on a Carpathia. It is vouched for by an officer of the Carpathia who requested that his name be withheld. This officer gave one of the most complete stories of the events that took place on the Carpathia from the first time she received the Titanic's appeal for assistance until she landed the survivors at the Cunard Line pier. Ismay reached the Carpathia in about the 7th lifeboat, said the officer. I didn't know who he was, but afterwards I heard the other members of the crew discussing his desire to get something to eat the minute he put his foot on the deck. The steward who waited on him reported that Ismay came dashing into the dining room and said, "Hurry, for God's sake, and get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is. Just bring it to me." The steward brought Ismay a load of stuff, and when he had finished, he had handed the man a $2 bill. "Your money is no good on this ship," the steward told him. "Take it," assisted Ismay. "I am well able to afford it. I will see to it that the boys of the Carpathia are well rewarded for this night's work." This promise started the steward making inquiries as to the identity of the man he had waited on. When he learned that he was Ismay, I did not see Ismay after the first few hours. He must have kept to his cabin. Reply to charges. Mr. Ismay's plan had been to return immediately to England, and he had wired that the steamer Cedric be held for himself and officers and members of the crew. But public sentiment and subpoenas of the Senate Investigation Committee prevented that from happening. In the face of the criticism aimed against him, Mr. Ismay issued a long statement in which he not only disclaimed responsibility for the Titanic's fatal collision, but also sought to clear himself of blame for everything that happened after the ship was wrecked. He laid the responsibility for the tragedy on Captain Smith. He expressed astonishment that his own conduct in the disaster had been made the subject of inquiry. He denied that he gave any order to Captain Smith. His position aboard was that any other first cabin passenger. He insisted, and he was never consulted by the captain. He denied telling anyone that he wished the ship would make a speed record. He called attention to the routine clause in the instructions to the White Star captains according to the White Star Line, ordering them to think of safety at all times. He did not dine with the captain, he said, and when the ship struck the berg, he was not sitting with the captain in the saloon. The managing director added that he was in the stateroom when the collision occurred. He told of helping to send women and children away in lifeboats on the starboard side, and said there was no women in sight on deck when he and William E. Carter of Bryan Moore, Pennsylvania, entered the collapsible boat, the last small craft left on that side of the vessel. He asserted that he pulled an oar and denied in sending the 3 messages from the Carpathia, urging the White Star officials to hold the Cedric for the survivors of the Titanic officer and crew list. He had intention to block investigation of the tragedy. Ismay asserted that he did not know there had been an investigation until the Cunard docked. Mr. William E. Carter of Bryan Moore, who with his family was saved, confirmed Mr. Ismay's assertions. "Mr. Ismay's statement is absolutely correct," said Mr. Carter. "There were no women on the deck when that boat was launched. We were the very last to leave the deck, and when we entered the lifeboat, because there were no women and children, we entered it and were lowered. The deck was deserted when the boat was launched, and Mr. Ismay and myself decided that we might as well enter the boat and pull away from the wreck. If he wants me, I assume that he will write to me. I can say nothing, however, that he has not already said. As our narratives are identical, the circumstances under which we were rescued from the Titanic were similar. We left the boat together and were picked up together, and further than that, we were the very last to leave the deck. I am ready to go to Washington to testify to the truth of Mr. Ismay's statement, and also give my own account at any time I may be called upon. If Mr. Ismay writes to me asking that I give a detailed account of our rescue, I will do so. Chapter 23. Financial Loss. Titanic, not fully insured, millions of diamonds aboard. Valuable mail. Loss to the Carpathia. So great was the interest in the tragedy, and so profound the grief at the tremendous loss of life, that for a time the financial loss was not considered. It was, however, the biggest ever suffered by marine insurance brokers. The liner was insured for $3,700,000, though it cost $10 million. And there were many millions in diamonds. The value of the policy covering the vessel against all ordinary risks was $5 million. But the whole of this amount was not insured, because the British and continental markets were not big enough to swallow it. The actual amount of insurance was $3,700,000, of which the owners themselves hold $750,000. The most valuable portion of the cargo was a consignment of diamonds worth more than $2,500,000. There's also a large consignment of bonds, but these can be duplicated. Other items were at least 50 tons of rubber worth $125,000 and some consignments of tea. Had the vessel sailed before instead of after Easter, the postal packets would have been much heavier. The following official notice was issued by the Post Office Department on April 18th. Among the millions of pieces of matter carried in the lost steamship Titanic, there were doubtlessly thousands of dollars worth of international money orders, together with descriptive lists of such orders. It is assumed that many of the remitters of those orders will communicate with the payees in this country concerning them, and that these payees in turn will take up the matter through their respective postmaster. It is an earnest desire of the department that in all such cases postmasters give careful attention to all the inquiries made and promptly report the facts to the third assistant postmaster general. Provision of money orders to the end that every effort may be made to ensure early payments to the intended beneficiaries. Underwriters will probably have to meet heavy claims of passengers for baggage, including jewelry. Pearls of one American woman insured in London were valued over $240,000. A member of a prominent firm of underwriters, before hearing that the liner went down, said, "Even if the Titanic reaches port, her owners will have to calculate on a loss of at least $750,000. But if she becomes a total loss, it will be an extremely serious matter. The vessel cost $10 million to build. Her hull is valued for the insurance purposes at $5 million.